Many thanks to Sophia and Alexandra for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I have a bit of a long paper, so I'm going to immediately jump into it, and my talk has 4 sections. I'm going to start with the question of global ethics and address the issue of what do we do with the pain and suffering of others, and where are the limits of compassion. In the second section, I'm going to address the issue of how the idea of we the people, how the idea of a global demos emerges, with particular focus on protest politics and what I call the erotics of resistance. In the third section, I'm going to share 2 examples with you to illustrate my arguments, and in the concluding section, I'm going to move to the challenges of desubalternization. So in recent years, an increasing number of global citizens' movements have taken justice as their explicit goal. At issue here are the scope and scale of struggles for justice. Now, in contrast to those who are committed to domestic justice and contribute to the well-being of immediate communities and fellow citizens, theorists and activists in the field of transnational justice argue for a broader and deeper commitment that would encompass strangers, both within and beyond state borders. They argue that in a globalized world, our duties and responsibilities are not limited to our fellow citizens. Rather, so the idea is not that I'm just responsible for my family and community and my fellow citizens, but rather the idea is that our accountability and our responsibility does not end at the borders, but rather we need to think about global ethics. So challenging imperialist globalization lies at the heart of counter-hegemonic movements that focus on human rights and on equitable distribution of resources, as well as politics of recognition and representation, to ensure that all members of world society have equal opportunities and parity of participation. So what is happening basically is that the idea of cosmopolitanism is making a comeback, and it's argued that this facilitates new alliances across state borders, regions, and even continents, thereby contesting patriotism and nationalism. In an increasingly globalized world, the lives of people who have never met, and perhaps who will never meet, are nonetheless intimately connected. This animates us to rethink our politics in a globalized world in the face of eroding state legitimacy. Now, just a little footnote to the notion of cosmopolitanism. As we know that the idea actually of cosmopolitanism was first proposed by Diogenes. And basically what happened was Diogenes was asked, where do you come from? And he wanted to shame Plato. Because when Plato thought of the demos, he could only think of the polis. Yeah, he could only think of Athens, and Diogenes wanted to show that, look, I've been outside Athens. I've seen that there is a world outside Athens, so he declared, I'm a citizen of the world. To show that, Plato, you are just a frog in the well, whereas I know that there is a world that exists outside the polis, outside Athens, which is why you need to also think about belonging and citizenship in broader terms. Now, this is considered to be a groundbreaking moment in intellectual history, since until then, issues of political consciousness were limited to individual city-states. The aim was to somehow expand the idea of belonging and also citizenship to encompass, so to speak, all of humanity. So Rousseau, for example, describes cosmopolites as people who are nowhere strangers and who are able to cross imaginary boundaries that separate people and embrace the whole of mankind in their benevolence. I'll come back to Kant a bit later, but Kant also has some very interesting ideas on Weltbürgerrecht, on world citizenship. Now, in her book, Cultivating Humanity, Martha Nussbaum, who's a feminist political philosopher, writes, and I quote her, "The world around us is inescapably international. Issues from business to agriculture, from human rights to relief for famine, call our imaginations to venture beyond narrow group loyalties and to consider the reality of distant lives. Cultivating our humanity in a complex, interlocking world involves understanding the ways in which common needs and aims are differently realized in different circumstances." Now, the emphasis here is on the urgency of acting in the face of suffering of others. It is overcoming apathy and indifference by realizing that we are not immune to the pain of others. So I'd like to share a couple of examples with you where somehow the effort is to see how art, how media can somehow work against what is called compassion fatigue. Yeah, so each of us is flooded and we are constantly encountering images of, people suffering, people in pain, people in need, people in solidarity, and we kind of feel overwhelmed because the feeling is you can't help everybody. Yeah, so then you feel like, okay, I can't help everybody, so I might as well not do anything. And even if I do something, I'll be called a racist or I'll be called an imperialist, particularly if you're a white European. So I'd rather, not risk doing anything because it anyway doesn't, in the long run, it doesn't really help. So how do we? What I'm going to share with you are a couple of examples which address this issue of compassion fatigue, and how the challenge is how do we overcome the rift, and I'm borrowing the term from the title, to overcome the distance between suffering and compassion. Yeah, it's a very nice play, it is in German, between Leid and Mitleid. So the first example comes from Martha Rosler, who's an American artist. And she has this wonderful series where she addresses, suburban life, where we continue, and it somehow in a way reflects our lives also, because we continue our lives despite the cognizance of what is happening in the background, the pain and the suffering that's happening in the background. So what we see in her images are happy American families who are, enjoying their everyday life, even as there is bloodshed in the background, and we're complicit in it. Yeah? So we are not immune, we are not distanced from it, and yet we continue with our lives. And what Rosler tries to do is juxtapose also what happened in Vietnam some decades ago with current wars. And when I first saw her images, I had to think about Mark Twain, who said that God created war so that Americans could learn geography. So this is the first image where you see the suburban housewife and suffering in the background. Another one, the selfie generation, where it's self-obsession. We are somehow constantly performing and staging ourselves, and in the background again you see conflict and destitution and dispossession. Another one here, which also shows the kind of limitations of this idea of global sisterhood, and limitations of also, or problematizes this idea of also the emancipated woman versus the poor, victimized Muslim women. The second example is Kevin Carter, who was an award-winning South African photographer. This is an older example. So this is from the 90s, where there was this horrible, horrible famine in Sudan, and Kevin Carter accompanied a group of aid workers to Sudan to take photographs. And it's a very famous image, and I must warn the audience, it's a very distressing image. So what happened was that he was about to photograph a little kid who was crawling towards the feeding center, and suddenly a vulture landed near the kid, and Carter was warned by the aid workers not to touch the kid because of fear of contamination. And Carter then narrates the event that he took the picture and then kind of tried and shoo the vulture away. He came under a lot of attack that he didn't help the kid, but he then tried to explain and defend himself that he was not allowed to. So that's the image, and when I saw this image, I had to think about Susan Sontag's very important essay on war photography and regarding the pain of others. Now, what happened was when he sold the image to New York Times, and it went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, and New York Times got calls from thousands of people asking what happened to the toddler, what happened to the young kid. We unfortunately don't know what happened to the girl, but we do know that Kevin Carter, a few months later, committed suicide. Now, there are a lot of speculations about why he committed suicide, but one of the arguments is that he said that he couldn't continue doing what he was doing. So at first, there seems to be nothing blameworthy about this demand that we, elite citizens of liberal democracies, take on responsibilities beyond the limits of our narrow self-interest, particularly in the face of growing global interdependence. Cosmopolitanism, based on the normative espousal of an expansive global consciousness opposes any kind of narrow and limited territorial loyalties. Rather, the idea is that we as transnational citizens participate in the establishment of democratic global institutions that would facilitate direct participation in global politics. So the protagonist of international civil society, whether it's institutionalized civil society or non-state actors like us, become indispensable in the implementation of cosmopolitan values, which the hope is would initiate a more just alter globalization. Another example I'd like to share with you all is the German sociologist Ulrich Beck, who points out that because we live in a world where there are multiple crises, so there is the ecological crisis, there's the financial crisis, there's the security crisis, which is why any kind of violation of rights in one part of the world is experienced everywhere. So Beck speaks about the globalization of risk. He says that we live in a world risk society where we are all equally vulnerable, and the antidote to the globalization of risk is what he calls the globalization of compassion. And this text was written a decade ago, and he says that how his main question is, how can we understand the relation between global risk and the creation of a global public? And he discusses a lot of examples, like Hurricane Katrina, the Haitian earthquake and the tsunamis. And he says that, one sees the unprecedented readiness of people to donate, from people living in faraway countries who don't have anything to do. I mean, these are strangers. These are people they'll never see, they'll never encounter. And yet there was an unprecedented readiness to donate to relief efforts. And he makes a connection between this globalization of compassion and what he calls these catastrophes, these natural catastrophes, as world media events. Yeah, that we are constantly encountering images, and that we cannot just somehow circumvent. We cannot just ignore he speaks about compulsory cosmopolitanism, that we are forced to be cosmopolites, so to speak, because there is a certain imperative to be accountable and responsible. Now, although Nussbaum and Beck enthusiastically endorse cosmopolitanism as a solution for past injustices and a promise for better times to come, I want to emphasize the complicities between liberal cosmopolitan articulations of solidarity. So solidarity has become a big word, global solidarity. And of course, as a feminist, as a queer post-colonial scholar, I do take the idea, the norm of solidarity seriously, and yet, for me, what is problematic is, so of course I'm interested in categories like, West and the rest, colonizer and colonized, white and black, straight and queer, Christian and Muslim, hegemonic and subaltern. But for me, one of the most important dualisms when we are talking about global solidarity is between those who give help, those who give benevolence, those who give aid, and those who are coded as receivers. Those who simply are passive receivers and cannot exercise any kind of agency to politically exercise any kind of claims. Yeah? So this discontinuity, and again to borrow the term from Sophia and Alexandra, this rift between the givers and the receivers, in my view, is a signature of the legacies of colonialism. So, Beck proposes, and others too, that our common vulnerability, so to speak, in the face of risk brings us together. And here I would argue that we might all be facing the same storm, but we are not all sitting in the same boat. And that makes all the difference. And I take this metaphor from Kofi Annan. After the climate talks in Copenhagen, Kofi Annan came out of the talks and gave this interview. And he said, we have to there is this imperative to act here and now. There is an urgency in the face of climate change to act here and now, because we are all sitting in the same boat. And in my mind, I thought, no, Kofi, and I'm not on first name basis with Kofi Annan. This was just happening in my head. And I was like, no, we're not. It's like the Titanic. The possibility and the probability of your survival depended on what the rich survived and the poor were the first to die. So we might be facing the same storm, but we're not all sitting in the same boat. Now, let me just add a little footnote about cosmopolitanism, because this was pointed out to me that, critique of cosmopolitanism is a bit tricky because it has a long, long tradition of anti-Semitism. Because the Jews were particularly connected with this idea of, those who are not patriotic and loyal to their country, and that, for example, Stalin led a very horrible anti-cosmopolitan campaign targeting Jewish intellectuals as ruthless cosmopolitans. So, or cosmopolitans who don't have a homeland. So I know this kind of anti-cosmopolitan rhetoric, and we are now living in an age of, renewed populist nationalism, where again cosmopolitanism is getting a lot of bad press. But my critique of cosmopolitanism somehow comes from another has a slightly different approach. And another critique of cosmopolitanism, for example, comes from somebody like Theresa May, who at the Conservative parties, at the Tories annual conference, remarked, if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. You don't understand what citizenship means, which is interesting because immediately when she took over as a prime minister, she landed in Bangalore and Hyderabad, and this is to hold high-power meetings for bilateral meetings with Indian technology companies for trade, and this is how she, staged herself. So a few days earlier, she was, talking about how cosmopolitanism is a, an empty term, and then a few days later, you see Theresa May do this. So, unlike these forms of anti-cosmopolitanism, which fall back on ethnic and economic nationalism, my concern comes from unreflected construction of this idea of we the people. Yeah, we the global demos, and the idea of borderless planet. So now let me outline my problem with the constitution of the global demos and the tricky politics of the tricky politics of street protest. So this section is called the erotics of resistance. In the past decades, there has been a proliferation of protest movements that seek to reconfigure international politics by way of interpolating a global demos that has been wronged by the neoliberal beast. So the idea is that we are all victims of neoliberalism, late capitalism. We are the 99%, the famous slogan of the Occupy movement. From Puerta del Sol to Taksim, from Sintagma to Tahrir Square, from Hong Kong to New Delhi, street politics seems to have transformed the way power, agency, and resistance are being perceived and performed. By inserting new actors into the political stage through appropriation and resignification of political processes, these counter-public spheres, it is argued, are instigating debates on issues of redistribution, recognition, and representation. So here I'm particularly thinking of the intervention that has been made by Judith Butler and Athena Athanasiou in their book Dispossession, where they talk about how street politics brings together immensely heterogeneous groups to induce what they call spontaneous solidarity. And they talk about how these bodies on the street, so Butler's recent book talks about political assembly, where people come together and they are vulnerable to police violence and that to police force and state violence, even as they oppose their disenfranchisement and marginalization and demand accountability from their political representatives. So Butler argues that the corporeality and collectivity of the masses as they assemble to protest political and economic dispossession can be read as an exercise of popular will, a bodily message of popular sovereignty. The occupation and claiming of public spaces marks a shift from political life from the corridors of power to the street. So in reclaiming democracy from capitalism and corporate power, it is argued, the subversive and disruptive potentiality of dispossessed, vulnerable, precarious bodies is evidence. So while I was reading Butler, I had to think about, of course, this famous iconic image of the Tiananmen Square tank man. And the other thing that I had to think about when I revisited this image was Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, has this very, very powerful metaphor of the state as monstre froid, the coldest of all cold monsters. And it's quite interesting because here you see the state monopoly on violence being embodied by its, the military here, and the non-state actor, civil society actor juxtaposed as this vulnerable body apropos this, monstrous state. And I will revisit the question of the dynamics between state and non-state actors when we are particularly talking about issues of desubalternization. So protest politics all over the world, in different parts of the world, evoke promises of radical political change through shaming powerful states and international financial institutions into good behavior. And this is what a lot of us are trying to do when we're constantly talking about Trump. I mean, one of my favorite pastimes nowadays when I'm totally stressed out is to watch political satire and watch them, try and shame Trump into good behavior. And I'm not so sure if that can be a systematic strategy towards accountability and responsibility, but I'll come back to that in my conclusion. Now the question remains, how effective are these fantasies of radical change through Facebook revolutions and Twitter insurgencies in fundamentally transforming social, political, and economic relations in the era of post-colonial late capitalism? Now, in my view, there is an intrinsic ambivalence at the heart of protest movements. On the one hand, without longings, desires, ideas, fantasies, pleasures. I'm a queer scholar, I'm very interested in the question of pleasure. Imagination. For another political order, resistance cannot be envisioned. So what these protest movements, what these performances of critique, what they try and do is powerfully negate the Tina principle. Margaret Thatcher told us there is no alternative. And the effort here is to show that there is another world is possible. And yet, it seems to me that fantasies and longings manifested in current protests wittingly and unwittingly reproduce processes of subalternization of marginal subjects and collectivities because these groups and individuals have a very, very tenuous relationship to both the state and civil society, whether it is domestic or international. So the romantic enthusiasm evoked by these movements erase the exploitative and exclusionary material conditions that make possible the exercise of agency of the dissidents. So let me just give you a very banal example. When an anti-capitalist protester twitters with her or his iPad, which is produced under super exploitative working conditions in the global south, the phantasma of the subversion of capitalism reveals itself as a surreal moment of class-privileged jouissance. The erotics of resistance that is marked by a new international division which sustains the discontinuities between those who resist and those who cannot. So when Foucault says, where there is power, there is resistance, I would add, where there is resistance, there is power. So now let me move on to the third section, where I'll share two examples with you, and then I'll conclude. I'm going to share a very short clip with you all.
Now on BBC4, a change to our schedule. Storyville.
So the Delhi gang rape case incited spontaneous national protests against sexual violence and the abysmal failure of the Indian state to ensure the safety of its female citizens. In a country with one of the highest incidents of rape in the world, it was, as is mentioned in the film, unprecedented when thousands and thousands and thousands of people came out to protest the lack of safety and mobility of women in public spaces. What was unique about these protests was that they were not organized by any political party or NGO, but as was expected, by any political party or NGO, full stop. As was expected, the Indian civil society was celebrated in the world media for taking to the streets, while the Indian government was sharply condemned for its violence against the protesters. So when this incident happened, I happened to be in the US, and whether it was the New York Times or Washington Post, there was very widespread coverage of this particular event. And it was indeed the case that, Indian feminism was celebrated, Indian feminism was congratulated for taking the lead in addressing this issue. But then, and I was also as enthusiastic as anybody else when this issue of sexual violence was addressed. As an old-fashioned feminist, for me, this is a very important issue that has for too long been brushed under the carpet. But then came the unprecedented part. The civil society contributed to creating an atmosphere where instant retributive justice measures, such as death penalty and castration of rapists, gained shrill popularity, while experts recommended technology-based criminal justice, which would involve surveillance cameras in public spaces, creating a database of sexual offenders, setting up fast-track courts to speed up the process of investigation, trial, judgment in cases of sexual violence. Now comes the part which was for me really, really instructive. Now, parallel to the Delhi gang rape, 19 Dalit, so-called untouchable women, were raped in the neighboring state of Haryana. And this was not even reported in the domestic press. Forget being mentioned in the international media. So now this raises the question, what kind of bodies have to be violated for the mobilization of the collectivity? Who is the we in whose name justice is being demanded? This demonstrates how subaltern groups are both marginalized by the state as well as civil society who claims to act in their name. Let me move on to the second example. This is from Germany, and as many of you all are familiar, I'm sure many of you all know about this. So in the aftermath of the sexual assaults during the 2016 New Year's Eve celebrations, what has happened is there's been a systematic demonization of all refugees as sexist and misogynist, while there has been a weakening of consensus in favor of Germany accepting large numbers of refugees. So this is an image of Pegida. This is the patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident. And they immediately took out a demonstration after the sexual assaults in Cologne, and they also coined this extremely racist neologism, refugees. And it's quite interesting to see. So this is, again, one of the most, I think, telling images where two women are holding up banners saying, Chancellor Merkel, you're more concerned about the rights of the refugees than your own citizens. Yeah? That you're not being accountable to us, rather you're more interested in protecting the rights of the citizens. And of course, other kinds of images which insinuate that, if we have a problem of rape in Europe, it's because these refugees and these migrants are bringing in their misogynistic, sexist cultures, because of course, European men don't rape. Yeah? Rape is not a domestic problem. Now, what is interesting is to just look at the backstory of this, because if you even have briefly engaged with colonial sexual and gender politics, one knows that the construction of the black rapist has a long history. Yeah? So this criminalization and demonization of black masculinity and the construction of the rapeable white woman has a long, there's a backstory to this, which is again and again invoked when one wants to, in a certain way, justify racist, orientalist, and colonialist narratives. This serves as what happened with the German welcome culture serves as a very good example of the fickleness of proclamations of European ethics and European solidarity. Again, another very good example of this is Charlie Hebdo, which has become an embodiment of liberal values in Europe. So this caricature was brought out immediately after the Cologne assaults, and what you see on your left side is a caricature or an image of Alan Kurdi, this young kid who died 2 summers ago and was washed up on the beach in Turkey. And the question is, what would have become of little Alan had he survived? Had he grown up? And what says at the bottom is he would have grown up to be a ass grabber in Germany. So this is again a very, very, I think, telling example of the limits of solidarity. And I had to think about, when I saw this image, I had to think about Immanuel Kant. So this brings me back to cosmopolitanism. So Kant, in Ewig und Frieden, in Perpetual Peace, talks about the idea of Weltbürgerrecht, of cosmopolitan right. And he talks about how everybody, each of us, has the right to hospitality. So if I land up at your doorstep, it's not just, it's not that I can expect you to extend hospitality to me, but rather it is my right to expect hospitality from you. However, Kant qualifies this whole ethics of hospitality, because he says that hospitality is only to be extended to those, the hosts have to extend hospitality to only those guests who behave themselves. As long as they behave themselves, they can expect hospitality, but if they are troublemakers, then you can withdraw hospitality. And Derrida does a very, very interesting reading of Kant and says, this is conditional hospitality is not true hospitality. So there is a certain hostility in Kant's idea of hospitality, and he talks about hospitality. Kantian hospitality, hostile hospitality. And he says true ethics is unconditional ethics, where the host becomes a hostage to the guest. Yeah? I mean, it's ideal theory. Yeah? I'm a philosopher, and we are very often accused of, living in a romantic bubble. But it is a very interesting and a very, very, I think, provocative challenge also to questions of global ethics. Now, before I move to my conclusion, I'd like to share with you all how there was an effort to respond to this very racist demonstrations organized by Pegida. So a group of feminists got together in Germany. This was immediately after the Pegida demonstrations, where they supported refugees to organize a little demonstration in front of the cathedral, the Cologne Cathedral, where the assaults happened. And later, a few weeks later, they organized a march in Cologne under the banner of our feminism is anti-racist. And the idea was inspired from Angela Davis, that you cannot imagine a feminism which is not anti-racist, and that we will, make an effort to make sure that our feminist principles are not instrumentalized to justify racism. So there was quite a big turnout. There were thousands of feminists and men who turned out at this demonstration, which was a counter-demonstration to Pegida. Now comes the ironic part. What happened was that there were a lot of anti-Fa groups, anti-racist groups, and a fight broke out between anti-fascist groups and the police. And particularly, I mean, this is what I've heard from some people who participated in the demonstration, that there was particularly a fight between female police officers who were being, also heckled by some of the demonstrators. And then migrants and refugees who were participating in this demonstration left because they didn't want to get into trouble with the police. So again, the irony, the groups in whose name solidarity was being staged, was being performed, could not participate in the counter-demonstration. So this, kind of raises questions about how should global solidarity work? How should we think about an equitable distribution of agency also? So it's not just an equitable distribution of resources, of participation, but also of agency, if we want to desubalternize and decolonize the world. So to conclude, I'd like to address a very important issue raised by the Sri Lankan feminist Malati De Alvis, who asks if we should be even allowed to witness the pain and suffering of other people if this witnessing only serves to affirm our humanity and our capacity to care. So how do we emerge, we transnational elites, emerge as ethical subjects who are trying to do good, who are trying to save the world by, in a certain way, instrumentalizing the pain and suffering of others? People who can't act in their own name, who are not allowed to act in their own name. And correspondingly, of course, if we are talking about global solidarity and talking about global ethics, we need to find authentic victims. who truly deserve our help, our benevolence. What do we do with those people who, in a certain way, refuse to be interpellated as appropriate objects of our solidarity? And what do we do with our will to empower the disenfranchised and the vulnerable? In Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Deleuze and Guattari have a wonderful quote, and I'll cite them. They say, the way a bureaucrat fondles his records, a judge administers justice, a businessman causes money to circulate, the way the bourgeoisie fucks the proletarian, flags, nations, armies, banks, get a lot of people aroused. End of quote. I would add that fantasies of global solidarity and radical change through ideas of protest politics, ideas of transnational movements are getting a lot of urban, class-privileged subjects very aroused, very excited. That's why I also talk about erotics of resistance. And what this kind of construction of we the people disavows is that we are complicit in the very structures that we are contesting, which is very conveniently veiled in this rhetorics of the disenfranchised global demos. So there still remains the question, the million-dollar question that Lenin asked, what to do? Yeah, was tun? And it is something that I'm struggling with. It is a question that I spend sleepless nights trying to address. But I take inspiration from the post-colonial feminist Gayatri Spivak. And my response to the question, what to do, is in my view, ethics and politics in the current age of rage and outrage. Yeah? So the nationalists are in the age of rage, and we anti-globalizers, anti-imperialists, anti-capitalists are in the age of outrage. Every time we hear that Trump has twittered something, or Merkel has done something, or Macron has done something, we all go into outrage. So how do we practice ethics and politics in the age of rage and outrage? And here I borrow from Spivak that doing politics and doing ethics is like brushing your teeth. Yeah? All of us got up today in the morning and brushed our teeth. None of us know, nobody has this insurance. We just heard a talk on insurance a few minutes ago. Has the insurance that we'll survive the day. I know I'm talking to a very young audience. There are a lot of students in the room. One should not be talking about morbid things like mortality, but it is a fact. When you get up in the morning and you brush your teeth, you don't know if you'll survive the day. So dental hygiene is without guarantees. Yeah, you brush your teeth thrice a day in the hope that you'll become 80 and still be able to enjoy a baguette, but you don't know. Yeah, so like I said, you get up in the morning, I mean, there are people who might say, why bother? I'm anyway going to die. And that's the whole, I think, challenge of also ethics and politics we are confronted with. It's a working without guarantee. You have to practice self-critique. You have to practice humility. You have to realize that we are not the solution. We were earlier talking about the Anthropocene, where there is also this reification of human agency. We have created the problem and we are going to solve it. And I think a first step, if we are taking issues of decolonization and desubalternization seriously, is that we transnational elites realize that we are not the solution, that we are, so to speak, the problem. So brush your teeth. And always remember, it is a working without guarantees, and that is the risk and responsibility of doing politics and ethics in a post-colonial world. Thank you for your attention.